Paul, welcome to the first podcast.
Welcome.
Great to be here. It's a privilege.
Maybe to start, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself and an overview of what aCommerce is?
So my name is Paul. I'm the group CEO for aCommerce, and we are an end-to-end e-commerce enabler, and we provide end-to-end services as well as a unified e-commerce platform for enterprise brands across Southeast Asia. We help them execute their e-commerce strategy and really a go-to-market for all the local countries in SEA.
And I think in comparison to a lot of the founders that we've had on this show, you have quite a prolific entrepreneurial journey. You've founded a lot of things, really interesting things, which we'll quickly unpack. But I guess if we take a step back, what was that sort of early origination story of yours?
When we first started really building businesses in Southeast Asia, back then in early 2000, you didn't really have e-commerce as a mature industry. So we really looked at what would be the best business model, especially in our markets, and we saw it as media and advertising. And so that we really started a first career in helping the likes of Yahoo and MSN, really with the content, we're selling the advertising. We helped them in Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. And that was the first business we built, really was, helping companies not only build content, but also sell advertising around that. And in the second part of it, when you look at a full funnel, we look at really everything from media and content to advertising to commerce, and then now logistics. And this is really what aCommerce does. But when we first started in Southeast Asia, it was really only media and advertising. To start off with, and built really businesses around that. So, the MSN Yahoo business, and then we built an advertising network. And the third business we built was what we called Insogo, which was the daily deals. And we were also doing marketplace, kind of before even Lazada and Shopee started. It was very early on, but we were selling basically digital vouchers, and then started moving towards products before we were acquired. And after exiting that business, we discovered that one of the biggest pain points we had when we were trying to build our marketplace model in Insogo was really the infrastructure, right? The logistics, the delivery, and that was very difficult, and that was the largest barrier we felt in Southeast Asia. And so hence, when we started aCommerce, that was really our primary focus, was how do we fix the logistics. And this was very much, early 2011, 2012, right?
This is day one really of this e-commerce cycle, right?
That's right. And so from that, we actually, our first problem we were trying to solve was the delivery problem. Because it doesn't matter, how good you are on the demand generation side, all the marketing, all the sales, but if you can't get the product, not only to the end consumer, but to actually collect also the money, meaning that COD was about 70% of all orders back then. So there was no, credit card wasn't adopted, or there, you didn't have kind of any really payment gateways that was efficient, right? And so COD was the primary way to, really sell anything, collect cash. So we decided to really build our own delivery fleet in Indonesia and in Thailand to fix this problem. And we weren't looking at just building the logistics. From day one, we felt that, when we looked at the entire stack, the content, the advertising, the commerce, and the logistics, we had to fix really from the bottom up first, which was the logistics.
Jumping back a little bit to early upbringing and background. So born and then raised subsequently in the US for most of your life, is that right?
That's right. I mean, I was born in Thailand. I grew up so before I was 10, lived in Philippines, Singapore, and really 10 years and up, I lived in the US. Grew up in Northern California, went to Berkeley, and then was able to really be fortunate to experience that Silicon Valley early 2000 boom, right? And then so I didn't even know what internet business was like, but after my first job at Ask Jeeves or Ask.com, that's where everything completely changed and completely got hooked onto internet and online models.
you grew up in the US for that sort of formative part of your academic career. You went to uni at a very well regarded institution, but then you came back out to Southeast Asia. Like, what was the thinking in that regard? Like, how did you guys frame that up, given what was happening in the US at the time would have been equally or maybe more exciting from the outsider looking in?
When I got into the first job with Ask.com or Ask Jeeves, that .com crash was happening. I was actually very fortunate because as part of the business development team, they didn't lay off the salespeople, business development team, right? Those are the ones you keep, right? And so the ones that are revenue generating. So we're very fortunate. It wasn't until my brother and he was at Apple then, and we actually had a trip to Thailand, a summer trip. When we came here, and all the learnings that we had from over there, when we came here, we were surfing, the Bangkok Post. I remember the website or the Nation, and a lot of these companies didn't even have advertising, right? So when we ourselves, saw that all these opportunities, media, building the media business, working in a media business, selling advertising, search keywords, and et cetera, and then coming out here to Southeast Asia, and no one was building anything, our eyes lit up, and we look. Why don't we try, just coming here for about 6 months and let's see, if we can actually try to build something. And so that was really, the start, I think, for us was discovering, coming out here and seeing that there was no real online business model or businesses set up. So, that was something that really excited us.
And there was obviously like DMS, there was New Media, AdMax, and Sogo, which you referenced. Like, again, we could probably spend a whole podcast like talking through those experiences. I guess before aCommerce, and you've had that breadth of founder wins and losses. Like, what were some of the key kind of lessons that you had out of those experiences before parlaying into aCom?
I think one of the biggest challenges, like you'd wish you could just build technology and sell it as SaaS, right? But I think one of the things we discovered was that you actually had to build a lot of services because people didn't even have the services or the capabilities in their business. When you think about building businesses back then, at least in Southeast Asia, we looked at how was online content being built and sold and et cetera. And, we had ideas on a platform to begin with, but the toughest thing was actually having to build the services around that, which was very unscalable. I know today you have those discussions around, the FDE in Palantir, for example, being able to have people that can go in and sell services with your platform. And, to this day, whether it's aCommerce, it's AdMax, early days, in Sogo, we've always had to really help onboard and build services, infrastructure with technology.
This is probably somewhat a rather personal question here, but I've always kind of wondered with like your career, like how do you juggle that all? Like, before we started this podcast, you're like, you got a lot of things on the work side of things right now with aCom. Obviously, you got to juggle that with family. You've just gone like founder mode multiple times before even going to aCom. Like, how have you kind of found that from a personal lens to be able to manage that?
Just personally, it's just, you're passionate about it, right? And I think many entrepreneurs, they want to invent new things and create a business. And, when we first started, building a media business and being able to exit that, right? For us, that was a, real eye opener. And, we, kind of our eyes lit up and got green. Like, you're able to really kind of build something valuable and be acquired by another company. But as you also look ahead, you also see that the market is evolving rapidly. Right, and things and technologies and trends change, and for us, it's so exciting to try to be on the forefront of a lot of these trends and on the cusp of that. And so that always excites us. We love building, and myself as well. And so meaning that when you think about where the market has evolved, right, it evolves very differently in each market. So we were building business primarily in Thailand, but when you look at Indonesia, you look at Singapore, a lot of these markets are very different. And so being able to not only build regional, but then having to localize that, for us, it's exciting because it's kind of, a first time that you're building something that's unique to the market. And so that, for us, the passion of just wanting to be an inventor and wanting to build, that just keeps us, helps us get out of bed every morning, right?
Do you remember day one of aCommerce? Like, when's if you think back to like the day your child's born, like what was day one for aCom?
The ideation of aCommerce was, it started actually from Ardent Capital, when, after the exits, we put money into, a fund where a venture fund and as well as also venture labs to build businesses. And I remember that a lot of the businesses we were looking at after our Insogo exit was we saw this huge opportunity that we thought in e-commerce, right? You see the Amazons of the world, the Alibabas, and when you look at Southeast Asia, no one was really building that. Biggest challenge for us was that the companies we were investing into, right, that we felt, we looked at it from an investment perspective first, was could we invest into the potential future e-commerce businesses, right, in Southeast Asia? And all of them had the similar problem, which was, there was no logistics infrastructure. There was the payments were lacking, COD, the delivery. And so because of that, you were investing, and the biggest problems and challenges of all of these startups that we were investing into was the back end and the infrastructure. We immediately went, look, we're experienced founders and entrepreneurs, and we felt that if we built this, our portfolios would benefit. And so that's where the idea really started. And I remember, when we were trying to help one of our portfolio companies outsource, and we went to a logistics provider. I'm not going to name the name, but we got in there, and there were people on the floor packing boxes. Right? They didn't have conveyor belts, or they didn't have tables even then. It was just, they were very much used to B2B, pallets in, pallets out. And so being able to break bulk, pick and pack, that didn't exist then. And so when we saw that, we felt that we probably could do potentially a better job of fixing that. But we also knew that like most businesses, you're going to also have quite a lot of different logistics providers. So we thought of, how can we provide really a full end-to-end solutions for our portfolio of startups. And that's where it really started, was to really help them out. And then as we built that, we started getting inbound leads from retailers as well as also some large brands that hey, we'd love to kind of work with you guys, because they all had as well an e-commerce strategy from global, wanted to execute it locally in Southeast Asia, but very, very difficult. And so when they saw us doing that, and it was some of the staff that we had were poached by larger brands, and they said, hey, you should actually think about working with aCommerce. And so that idea was born when we started getting all these kind of inbound leads coming in from the larger brands and retailers.
I've somewhat been in this industry for a while, and it all seems like a little bit of a blur to this point, right? Like, it's like if you take a step back and look at 2013 when you guys started, right? Like who were the players, right? Like now it's very different, but what was it like back then?
You had just really the large logistics players doing the B2B, but Lazada was just coming in. It was around 2012, I believe.
There was no Shopee, right? I mean, Shopee was two or 3 years later.
That's right. Yeah. And Lazada just literally set up. And so when we saw that, also being somewhat competitive, we weren't 100% sure whether or not, Lazada was just going to build marketplace or they were going end to end. But from the get-go, we realized that in order for us to compete in the marketplace, to build a marketplace, we did some of our research and we realized that, you'd require billions and billions of dollars to compete in that space. You look at the likes of Amazon, Alibaba in the US, and we knew we didn't want to get into that space, right? Because it would be so competitive and you have to raise that significant amount. So we looked at really models that would be like the picks and shovels of the industry. And so that was why we chose the enablement model, was we'd rather be the enabler rather as opposed to just the channel. And we also saw that from a global trend coming into Southeast Asia and the experience we had from our advertising business, that you see a lot, that there would be a lot of marketplaces, not just one, but we saw, the Amazons, the Alibabas, and basically rest of the world would start to enter Southeast Asia and be very competitive. And we felt that with that happening, in the future, the best thing would be to actually be the enablement, the enabler model, and aggregate all the channels, but also have an aggregator model for the services as well as also the, the infrastructure and the logistics.
But I think it's interesting because when you take a step back, like what happened from that point is that, for an extended period, Southeast Asia became the world's fastest growing commerce market. Like everyone came to SEA for a period, right? And really the industry, was doubling every year early on. And if you think about it, like you guys abstracted yourself out a lot of that direct competition, but because there was so much competition happening at the consumer, people were coming down to your level, they were competing, there was a lot to navigate. and I think there's often this survivorship bias. Like, you guys are around and growing and big today and arguably the number one in the category. But like, there's been many enablers that have gone to the grave, and there've been a lot of marketplaces that haven't panned out. Like, how did you navigate that period? Because there was so much changing in that early formative years of commerce.
Yeah, I think probably one of our biggest, I wouldn't say regrets, but was actually going public with the amount of money we raised, right? And that was pretty significant, back then in terms of 30 million plus. Because of that, a lot of the kind of smaller enablers were also able to raise capital. And then it got really competitive after that, as people started to point out, hey, that is a model to follow, right? And so, I think now I understand why some startups will stay stealth for quite some time. And, I kind of wish we didn't really go public with that. Of course, we benefited also. The brands all want to work with us. We were able to also recruit, top tier talent. So I think that was valuable. But, that got really competitive. But we also actually saw that it wasn't just going to be the marketplaces. We felt that, when you look at the total retail market, we also saw that the likes of the top retailers were eventually going to go online, and even if they would be very challenged with trying to build up their capabilities and their infrastructure, you're looking at the brands, the distributors, the retailers, and so the ecosystem we saw wasn't just really what the marketplaces, but you had a lot of this offline retail that was all going to migrate online, and we saw that when you look at China now, it's close to 50%, and we saw that it would happen in Southeast Asia. And so we felt that there was enough in terms of a market, to share with, other enablers. And so we were just really laser focused on not just trying to support necessarily, an individual channel like a marketplace, but rather, brand.com, B2B, really kind of multi-channel, omni-channel. That was our focus, and really building also technology from day one to be able to scale to that. And so we did our initial research when we were starting this model. So we called up the likes of a company called aCommerce, which was in the US. They eventually became eBay Enterprise. They were acquired by eBay. And I remember the first conversation we had with that COO, and he was saying, look, you cannot skimp on your infrastructure. Right? From day one, this isn't a lean startup model. You have to make sure you have the platform down. You have to have the infrastructure, the services. I wish we'd have taken that advice. And we did take about 70% of that advice because we felt that 70% of the infrastructure itself was good enough. But, in hindsight, we should probably have invested a lot more in probably building out the technology stack, much sooner, because then it would have really allowed us to scale.
It's interesting, this is my observation having worked with you. When I came into Jakarta and that Indonesia business, I remember, we had brands across 15 different marketplaces, I think, for some of the brands at that point in time, which just shows you how insane the e-commerce market there was. Matahari Mall, Blibli, Bukalapak, Shopee, Lazada, etc. To your credits, I think you've always been able to see a few steps ahead in the e-commerce landscape and be super laser focused on where you think things are going to head, because you had that sort of era where there was the proliferation of everything and it was, going to the moon. Then you had the Lazada-Shopee competition era. And then you had the Shopee has beaten Lazada era. And now you're in this kind of, I guess, new era. And I'm keen to get your take on it, right? Because now we have this sort of new stage where it's okay, a new competitor came in, and that's TikTok Shop, and they're doing content creator-led commerce. Meta's still on the sidelines a bit with that potentially. YouTube affiliates hanging around this region a little bit as well. I'm really just keen to get your take on where you think things will go next.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting. I think, when you look at the world now with AI as well, right? So you have now AI commerce, and you read a lot of that, right? Really all the answer engines, because they're kind of bypassing a lot of the search now. And so what that is driving is actually now, would you want that traffic to go to the marketplace, right, where commissions are just going up and up, or do you want it to go to the brand.com? And so now we see this renaissance, a change where brands are now thinking about, how do I take advantage of AI, right, and have it drive towards my own brand.com, right? So that's an entirely new channel that's increasing. But you also, when a brand looks at brand.com, they're not only thinking direct to consumer, they're also thinking B2B as well, right? And so they're thinking actually multi-channel, omni-channel. How do they manage all their existing offline retailers?
Yeah.
How do they manage all the marketplaces? And yes, you have marketplaces, Lazada and Shopee, but then you have this, social commerce where TikTok has, taken that. For me, it's always content, advertising, commerce, and logistics. But TikTok's probably the one company and that one platform that does the full stack incredibly well, right? But for brands, they don't just look at one channel, right? They're going to look at multiple different channels. And so again, TikTok will be one, but you're going to start to see really meta commerce. You're going to see Google, YouTube. And so, the world we see is very fragmented, right? And for a brand, for them, they always think by channel, actually, since offline. So when they think online, they're going, now you have about 8 different, platforms and even business models for them to execute. Right on. And so this is, the more fragmented and complex e-commerce gets, it matches to our model because for us, the inventory has to make sure that it feeds across all the different channels. Then you start, when you think about when we first started with aCommerce, we solved the logistics piece and then we started really kind of the demand fulfillment. We started moving up to the, really the demand generation side. And that's important because you have the technology and then the data, right? And so that is important to where how can you now take a product from the brand and make sure that it is fed along with content, with advertising, with inventory, with delivery across any one of these channels. And I think you guys were mentioning earlier the kind of the product information management, right? Like the PDP. And what's really fascinating now with AI, right, is that, we look at the PIM or the product information management into really kind of what we call a PXM, which is a product experience management. And a lot of people will only look at the customer journey, right, of how a consumer buys a product. But how we look at it is how does a brand take a product and create a whole experience around that product across all the channels. And I'll tell you how that's being done today. Yes, you really kind of what we call the DAM, right? Asset management, the digital asset management, the content, and also the pricing and et cetera. What's interesting now with the PXM is that you are also looking at, how does the brand look at the analytics and the data across all the different channels. And with AI, as you are able to then extrapolate that data about that specific channel, now AI can actually create the content for that specific channel that's unique, that PDP, right? So when you think about content, a lot of people just think it's product information, but actually you're creating how-to videos, FAQs, right? So a lot of content. And so we look at it as how do you help brands really create a brand and a product experience around it across all the different channels, tailored and unique for each channel. Right? And so that's where it really excites us because, that opportunity has opened up specifically with AI.
We were lamenting before we started recording that, for a long period, the innovation in e-commerce seemed to stagnate, right? Like there was obviously a lot of competition on the front line, a lot of dollars going into consumer eyeballs and revenue generation for e-commerce marketplaces. But in terms of the stack, it became pretty settled. It was like an early SaaS category, I would argue. But now that's all changed. It's like commerce is cool again, right? But I think the thing that I've always valued in our conversations, Paul, is like you guys are at the front line. You're working with several hundred of the world's leading brands, from FMCG to electronics to all these different categories. Right now, as we sit here late 2025, like what are brands telling you they need? Like, what are they asking for? And what's is it truly that they're like, I need to figure out agentic commerce the next 6 months? I need to figure out GEO. Like, what are people asking aCommerce for in terms of solutions they wouldn't have been asking for 2 years ago?
But brands are asking about an AI strategy, right? Specifically, what are you guys working on? And, we have remits from global to really start to look at how can we become present, right, and take advantage of the growth of AI engines and AI chat. And for some, in the research, you're looking at by 2028 that really ChatGPT is going to bypass Google, right, in terms of usage of people asking for brands and products and driving directly to commerce. And so there's this urgency for all these brands to make sure that they are being discovered. And of course, Google, again, with AI overviews, so Gemini is definitely going to take advantage of that opportunity. But you see ChatGPT, Perplexity, kind of all these other Claude and etc. But again, multiple different channels. And then we also see that the social commerce guys, right? TikTok, Meta, YouTube, they too also have actually an AI model and commerce models built in. So we see that just the brands are asking, look, how can we position ourselves to make sure that we can be across all of these different channels? And that starts off again with the brand.com, right? Until they start to really wake up to it, that they now need a brand.com to make sure that they're managing their data, their content, their customers, right, centrally, unified across all of these different new channels. So, they ask us because we're fairly neutral. When you think about, what I mean by neutral is that, you cannot ask Shopee or Lazada to help sell across all these other channels.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the inventory sits with us, the content sits with us. And what's fascinating is that we actually are also generating new assets, new content with AI with these brands. And what we call Content Hub, right? So we build a Content Hub that enables them to manage their PDP, their pricing, their images, their videos generated across all of these different platforms. And that data and analytics for the brands to be able to know what type of advertising, what type of content creates, and drives to a revenue by channel, right? Is, for them a holy grail. And it's completely new data that they're getting. And so some of the requests that we're being asked by the brands is, can you help us look at offline? Right. And what I mean by that is that we have a large global beauty brand that's asking us to take the images, right, that their field marketing team has taken across 16 different countries in APAC. And it's asking us to help analyze that data from physical retail stores, right? Because, they need to know how do they fit on what we call a retail shelf. Because we analyze the digital share of shelf, the shelf analytics for them across all the marketplaces. And they see that wealth of data, right, is so powerful. And they want the same for offline. But of course, being able to aggregate that data offline is, challenging because you got to have a physical person actually do it. And the brands are already doing that. So for them, they naturally want to really, kind of combine both online and offline. And this is where for us it's exciting because this is a whole new opportunity. And maybe just to backtrack and show you that, when we first started, really we saw the business evolving into three key phases. The first 5 years for us was really about aggregation. How do we aggregate all the channels? How do we aggregate all the data for the brands? How do we aggregate all the logistics providers to make it, to unify that end to end? So first was, the aggregation, and then the next 5 years is automation. And to automate that entire process where you would see an ad, being able to make sure that, do you have the inventory to be able to fulfill on that ad? And so all the systems have to connect. The automation was next. And then what we see now is, once you have all the data and all the automation, how do you make that agentic? And so I know that's all A's, whether that's aggregation, automation, all the way to agentic. And this was exciting for us is 2025 and beyond for the next 5-10 years is now how do we take all the data and analytics and all our physical infrastructure, all our software, all our services, and really start to look at how do we make it agentic, right? And so that is what's exciting, for the next, the future.
You and I have spoken over the years around, I think a lot of people saw Southeast Asia, looked to China and said, well, it's just going to look like that. It's going to be a tale of two stories, like a Tencent Alibaba, and that's going to be how the market evolves. And I think we always felt there was going to be a multi-channel play because of the fragmentation of market and consumer type. And so brand.com was going to have a greater role. And I think I looked like I was wrong for many years because Shopee and Lazada was so dominant. But as you sit here today and what we've seen play out with TikTok and now I think with the AI platforms, do you think that the world shifted on its axis a bit and we're now going to enter a world where Southeast Asia brand.com is going to be a much more meaningful part of the story in the next few years?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, when you think the way the market has evolved, in the US, actually the brand.com very much was similar to the growth as marketplace, right? But here, there was a lot of delays in executing their brand.com, where I think there's a significant step change was when you saw how fast AI grew, right? In terms of the AI engines and the chat, and now where the way people are really searching, right? They're searching about the category, the content side, not necessarily about a specific brand. And so that means that this is huge opportunity for brands to now being able to grab that, to be the category lead or the subcategory lead within, to be the answer for all the AI engines. And so because of that, now where does that traffic lead to? Right, and that's where they start to think. Do you don't want to keep driving it to the marketplaces because, again, for them, that's they've invested. They have to give up.
You're almost driving traffic on behalf of the market.
Exactly.
It's the inverse argument, right?
That's
to why
right.
marketplaces exist.
Yeah. And then now, of course, they also have commerce as well built into these AI engines where they connect you directly. They have an API, and
then they'll have them more and more.
Yeah, exactly, with Shopify.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, yes, it's initially now being really triggered by the AI engines. But when you think about what the brand is thinking, is now it's not just for the AI engines. It's now for all of the different channels. They want to make sure that they have a cohesive, unified, central story for their brand, right? All that content, the how-tos, the FAQs, right? The ratings and reviews.
Yep.
So these are all the things that now a brand is starting to think about in terms of the longer term, and so that really starts with building up their own assets.
As a commerce nerd, I always enjoy our conversations because I always have some aha moments. So I wrote down a couple of points, but given we do have a lot of founders listen to this show, and just given your wealth of experience founding companies, I do want to touch on a couple of topics. I think we'll start with people. You've been successful at growing a very substantial people base across Southeast Asia, across multiple markets. And I guess, if we take a step back and look at the start of aCom, like how did you convince those first team members to kind of join you on your vision and your journey?
We were very fortunate to just be in an industry that I think everyone really wanted to get experience with. I mean, I have, parents with the kids that want to intern at our business because they know that e-commerce is going to be the future, right? And for you think about business, it's really all about commerce, right? And so therefore, I remember you think about kids that even want to go work for an e-commerce company. Where we were able to attract talent was they saw that this is where the market was heading towards. And so it was an easy sell that they wanted to be able to have that experience in their resume and to be part of building something that is the largest industry or the largest in the digital economy, right? The largest sector in the digital economy. And so I think the market sold it as well in terms of, and then them themselves were also buyers and consumers. So they were buying on Lazada, on Shopee, and brand.coms and et cetera. So they experienced it themselves in terms of, and they saw the challenges as well. And so when we, in our interviews and as we were recruiting, all these talent, right? I think it was really easy for us to be able to really, tell our vision and our story because they personally felt the pain themselves and saw the opportunities. And so we felt that was, easy for us to recruit, in terms of the talent. But I think also that, when you think about, multiple different markets and opportunities. So when you look at the e-commerce industry, it's, logistics, it's retail, it's marketing, it's technology. It's 4 different industries in one. And so the way they saw it would be like they could learn quite a lot from different industries all in one company. But also in terms of a career path was the opportunity to be able to work in new markets, expanding outside of, we have Thais working in Singapore, Filipinos working in, in Malaysia and vice versa. And so I think that opportunity for them to be able to really grow and experience, not only from an industry perspective, but also, from a, working in a new country, right? Like that excited a lot of people.
I think you're being a little bit humble because I remember when we had the privilege to first invest in aCommerce, one of the biggest problems we would talk about at board meetings is like you guys were seen as too good of a training ground. Like it was a place for people to come poach their staff. Like I remember the Lazadas and the Shopees as they were spooling up, it was like, great, we'll go to aCommerce. It's a great academy to learn. It's like, how did you guys prioritize learning and development so early on? I think in what was an industry that was still cottage and people were just quite brutal and ruthless, I think, with how they manage teams. And you guys always seem to have a lot of care and commitment to talent development, which at some points worked against you as people, were poached. But it's like, how did you guys frame that early on?
I mean, I think building the culture, I think, was really important, right? And for us, it was how do we make sure that the guys that we hired had autonomy, had actually, it wasn't micromanagement, but it gave them an opportunity to look. We have challenges in logistics, and we would take people and create basically small teams to fix very specific needs in our entire value chain. And I think that some of them were overwhelmed, that they would be like, wow, I have to go into Indonesia to fix logistics in Indonesia. It was an incredibly big problem to solve. But actually having the trust in them to be able to build that, to go in and build that from scratch, I think was what people were really excited about. They were given real difficult challenges to fix. And so that was one. The other one was that probably one of the most useful hires that we did was a chief people officer, which was somebody that was dedicated around really training, so onboarding talent, right? So everything from also making sure that we created what we call the aCommerce Academy that enabled us to make sure that not only these guys were being trained, but they could even earn a certificate in e-commerce. And sometimes it's challenging that I remember that the companies that were poaching our staff, they would just say aCommerce plus 20, right? And that was aCommerce plus 20%. So whatever aCommerce is paying you will give you 20%. And that was, be very honest, that was brutal. And that was, I remember that period was like, how do we stop this bleeding, right? And, because they're given easier jobs in big brands or retailers, and getting paid a lot more, right? But there were just, the ones that stayed were the ones that loved the mission, loved the idea of being able to build something from scratch, right? Or solve a really complex problem. Of course, the stock options definitely helped, right? But I think that them knowing that they were in the forefront of e-commerce when they were working with aCommerce, right, was what excited them, right? The ability for them to invent and create new things where, the other companies that were poaching us, they were more playing catch up, or they were very specific in just their brand or just their retail, where we were solving multiple problems across the industry. And so that really excited people. From that perspective, right, you would see that, individuals felt that, they could actually learn and grow, where when they left to brands or to retailers, we actually still kept in touch with them. The aCommerce alumni is what we call them. That group has actually helped us significantly, because what happens is that when they leave and they actually work in that business, they realize all of the pain points.
It's the McKinsey model, right?
Yeah, yes. It's very similar. Yeah. And they learned all the difficulties of actually building e-commerce, and hence now then they recommend to basically work with us and outsource to us. So that was actually also a benefit from that.
I think you've somewhat answered one of my questions, but I was going to ask, in reflection, what were some of the traits that you think resonate well to be successful at aCommerce? Are there any other traits that you've seen with successful folk at aCommerce?
I mean, I think the guys that have the tenacity, the hard work, and they like actually again solving these difficult problems, and so I feel that mission alone for them was really got them to focus and own the problem. We really have a culture in where it's a lot of teamwork, right? So because we're solving such difficult problems, that having peers that they know kind of have their back, right? That they can support them, right? So we made sure that it was not a finger pointing kind of blame, or we actually encourage people to make mistakes, because that's how quickly we can learn. So the idea is, you kind of break things and build things up. We encourage people to learn from their mistakes. We never really made people, felt like, it was okay to make mistakes. It was okay to, try and recommend something all the way up to a CEO, right? Because they saw issues. And, I remember us having what we called not only whistleblower, but, any challenge, any problems that they saw across the business. I mean, you were operating across, 5 countries, 32 live studios, 9 warehouses, over, close to 1,000 staff, right? You want to be able to make sure that the guy, that's in the warehouse actually when he sees a challenge or sees a problem, it's heard all the way to the top,
Yep.
right? And so I think that sometimes employees and teams feel that there's a problem and the company's doesn't really care about it or doesn't solve it. It becomes very frustrating for them, and I think that's one of the reasons why some people will leave. But where for us, we listen, and we then after we diagnose the problem, then we work with them to make sure that they're driving and fixing it. So we try to empower a lot of our teams to make sure that they have the right tools and support in place to again fix whatever challenge they see.
I guess in reflection, over the course of the last plus decade, how do you look at a fundraise process, I guess, in the early days, like in the seed and the A, versus now being what is a very mature company? How has that evolution been, I guess, for you? And maybe, some tactics or strategies that you could impart on any founders listening?
I think the A round, now versus let's say 10 years ago is very different, right? Because back then, it was really the problem that you're trying to solve, the team that you have, right, and looking at the market opportunity. But I think that we were fortunate that our experience from previous fundraisers or previous being a serial entrepreneur, I think that really helps because people know that you've gone through all the pain, you got through all the problems, and you have that grit, right? And so I think that that's really important because I think a lot of investors know that this building a startup, really requires that passion, that dedication, that commitment. And so I think that from the get-go, I think that's really important that whatever that founders can make sure that yes, you may have domain expertise, but you have that grit, right, to actually making sure that you can build and go through all the problems, right? And so I think founders, it's really important for them to be able to portray that, but also to really understand your market, to actually do the research, to be able to make sure that you got your unit economics right, like in terms of how you plan to get to profitability. I think back then it was more about how do you build revenue, grab market share, and really kind of create an industry. But now the market's so mature that everyone wants a path to profitability almost from day one, and they want to at least have you think that through, right? But also, how do you build your moat? How do you protect your whatever business that you will create or industries that that you may have an advantage with? Now, how do you play defense against not only other startups but incumbents in that sector, and also basically new market entry, new competitors entering the market? You have to balance, make sure that you're able to address a lot of these concerns, and of course, on top of all that, is that market, is that industry really big enough to attract investors, right? Because that is also one of the biggest challenges when you look at a market like ours. We're very much regionally focused, and so the industries that you have to go after is sizable. Where from the investor's perspective, the returns are meaningful, right? Versus solving a small problem, right? And so that's something I think a lot of founders, especially today, have to really think about. You don't have to think about it from day one because everyone will have kind of you obviously have to start somewhere, and you can tackle more of a small issue or a problem, but the overall industry and that sector that you plan to eventually go upstream or downstream from that, if you cannot show that that industry is that opportunity of going upstream or downstream is big enough, that's going to be very challenging to raise funding.
Because we've had the privilege of being along the journey with you into a moment in time, and I think it's a great example of trying to navigate changing market dynamics and challenges. I think it's in public record that like towards the end of 21, 22, we'd had aCommerce at a really good couple of years. We were really at a point where we felt there was a company that was ready for public market environment, and we were very close to an IPO that was going to be very successful. And literally, probably you could argue days to weeks before that IPO day, the market capitulated, and we know that we've been on a multi-year kind of recovery since then. And in that moment, we were probably of all companies out there, one of the closest, at least in our region, to kind of having that moment in time of kind of going public. How did you navigate that? Like, how do you as a CEO have to stand up in front of people and one, say, hey, look, this thing that we've been working towards is not going to happen anytime soon. And now I have to shift gears, and I have to shift the focus of the business because it's not just all about growth now, it's about profitability. And I want to close the loop and say, well, like, where we are sitting today, you guys have done that. Like, you guys are fast growing still. You're a really profitable business. You've retained an incredible team around you. I don't know sometimes how you've managed to do that. So it's like, walk me through what it was like in that moment, and I guess how you've navigated that and the advice that you can impart on people.
I think what's really important is, being honest, being open, and sharing information with your team, right? Because sometimes, founders or even CEOs they feel like they have to shield like any challenges and any problems from their team and try to kind of take that all on themselves. My philosophy is like, look, guys, this is the market, right? And so collectively as a team, how do we navigate this together, right? And so rather than making it just kind of my problem, the challenges I think a lot of founders face is, maybe in an analogy of being on a team, a basketball team or a football team, right? In that there are times where you have to play, the player, to be the player, right? To lead by example. And there are times where you actually have to be the team captain, right? Which is to make sure that you're not the leading scorer, or not the the guy that's driving all the sales, but actually how do you get everyone to work well together as a captain? And then there's also being the coach, right? And so across kind of all of these phases of the business, which role do you play in, right? And so some founders will wear multiple hats. For this kind of new initiatives with AI, I'm now discovering I'm becoming a player again, right? And so whichever kind of challenges that you're tackling, just to go back to what Ben was saying in terms of the IPO, right? I was actually a captain. I felt that being a captain, meaning that look, really with the team, right? The challenges that we saw with the market, and now how the market, when you look at the tech market in the US, I mean, the timing was probably the worst timing, for us, right? Because we spent about a year and a half prepping for the IPO, got all our ducks lined up, everything ready, and all of a sudden the market just falls out, and so and having to delay that IPO and completely making a shift from all this growth that you were expecting to now really grabbing market share, driving revenue, to now completely we need to get to profitability as soon as possible, like ASAP. And I think some companies that didn't survive didn't make that transition fast enough. Because I've been in a few businesses where we've had to lay off 40% of staff, worse, right? Around 7-8 years ago. To sometimes you don't have to lay that huge of a team, but you cut back 15 or 20%. But it's how fast you can do it and recover the business from that. And I remember having a town hall and having a lot of these employees that were asking like, why were we doing what we were doing, and being transparent and really just sharing with them, these are the challenges by market, right, in our industry, right, also in terms of where the health of our business, right, sharing the unit economics of our business and getting them to really understand why we're doing what we're doing. And because of that, even the guys that couldn't continue, right, and we had to trim down some of our team, they respected the decision. They didn't become they didn't become problematic, right? In fact, they were very supportive and they understood, right? Because I think for us, just being transparent and being open about why we were doing things, and I think that's why I think that's where it's really important to not only share that with your executive team, but even your middle management team and all the way the guys that may not really understand business as much, but when you try to explain it to them, they really respect that. Well, some of the guys that got laid off, but they understood about why that happened. When you're transparent and you're open and you're honest, right? I think that a lot of the guys will respect you for that.
How did you manage the mental health side of things? You're having to go out and be the guy and communicate. There's a whole cognitive shift that happens. Like, what did you do? Is it just you double down on families, the unlock? Like, what was the thing that got you through that period, which was, you guys have come out the other side even stronger. Like, the business today is in a really good spot. But for that moment in time, like, what got you through?
Actually, when you see case studies of what other people have gone through, right? The autobiographies that you read, the hard things about hard things, and you see the gut-wrenching things that founders and CEOs go through, and you start to realize, like, this isn't just me. This is what business is like, right? And so being able to see and read about others, right, and seeing what they've gone through and learn, kind of picking out the points that you think is applicable to your situation, I think was really, really helpful for me. Of course, it's, being able to sit down and, talk to your team about it, but a lot of these guys have not been through that, right? So for me, it's being able to, number one is, to really understand, in terms of where we are in the business cycle and, and look for case studies of what has happened to other companies in this situation and what did they do. But also I think it's valuable that I have, brothers as well that I can confide to. I feel that I'm very fortunate to be able to have that mental support, right? Where you can sit there and of course it's a lot of yelling and screaming, right? And brothers is like, you're screaming and you can, say really direct things, right? That you would never ever talk about with, execs and et cetera. And I think that harshness was really important for you to go, okay, are we done with the real harshness now? Let's see, how can we build on top of this, right? So once you almost experience the bottom, right, of how do we get ourselves into this situation, right? What you can point the finger at yourself and and have that kind of open, honest, kind of break it all down. From that, I think it's really important because it enables you to then build on top of that. And so when then you go out and you talk to in a town hall with the whole company, it's a lot easier, I would say, right? Because you've been through even more of that rigorous kind of finger pointing, and that happens of course behind closed doors. But I would say that mental support I think is really important. And if founders can find whether it's other founders that they can do that with. But, of course, you don't want to, obviously break that relationship. And that's why I think when you have siblings that you can do that with, it can be really helpful.
I feel like you've just given us a treasure trove of great points, like the basketball analogy, transparency when times are tough, find case studies, be direct with the right people, whether it's siblings, etc. I guess I will still ask the question, is there anything else remaining that you would still impart on founders that are listening, just given, the amount of experience that you've had in founding multiple companies?
No, I think that it's really important for founders to always, make sure that they keep building on the passion, right? Because that passion that you have, right? You want to keep, what drives that? And whether you're competitive and you see competitors doing it, or you see really great new business models like AI that's now in the market and it's even a bigger opportunity. And so the more that founders know what drives that innate passion that gets them excited, I think it's really important to keep making sure that they keep feeding that. Right? Because sometimes you can get so absorbed in the day-to-day, right, that you don't find yourself time to actually, yes, you have to look after your health. Mental health, I think, is important. But for me, I tend to find, I realize I look for things that will keep driving that passion, right? And that, I think, is really important. And, people have that in very different ways. I find now that when I look at my family, I have two 12-year-old twins. For me, seeing them to become potential entrepreneurs, right? It excites me that I'm trying to teach them what entrepreneurship is like. And as I'm teaching them what entrepreneurship is like, it's bringing back also, that innate kind of, you have to be passionate about something. You have to, what are you into? Whatever you're into, right? Make sure that you find things to keep you excited about that. Because a lot of us will tend to, sometimes lose that. And I think, to keep that constant passion is tough. And wherever you can find it, my recommendation is, you have to make sure you spend time to actually keep rekindling that.
Paul, thanks for joining us on The First.
Thank you.
Thank you.